Welcome once again to Captain Fred's Aviation Theater. Today we're visiting with Gale Hess and his Vollmer Amphibion, which, Gale, you built it from scratch by yourself?
Yes, I did, Fred. It's called a plans built, and you make all the parts.
So it's not a kit?
It's not a kit.
You just have the plans?
I have the plans. I used a pile of steel and a pile of wood, which, by the way, still had the bark on the edges.
Is that right? Why did you choose a seaplane or an amphibian?
Well, I had visions years ago of flying all over Mexico and Canada, and I had a love for the outdoors and the water, and thought this will really fit into my needs. I, of course, then contacted Vollmer Jensen, who designed this airplane, and he had built it to satisfy a need that he had, which was for scuba diving. So these sort of fit together, and I decided upon the Vollmer.
I flew against him one time.
Oh, is that right?
In ultralights. They were just coming out, and he designed an ultralight airplane also.
He became very famous in the ultralight world, as I understand. One of his ultralights, of course, flew first across the English Channel.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back and talk about the history of aquatic airplanes. I would assume that the first one would be Glenn Curtis, who put pontoons on his pusher here in San Diego.
Well, as I understand, that's correct also. In 1911, he actually made the first flight off of the waters here in San Diego Bay. Glenn went on to be a prolific and with many inventions. And,
now, you mentioned a step or something that he designed.
Yes, the Amphibion in my airplane has a step, which is a kind of a juncture, if you will, or a step, perhaps it's best called, back of the cockpit, the bottom of the fuselage, and its purpose is to reduce the vacuum effect that you get when taking off of the water. It benefited not only...
It lets the plane sit more level?
Well, actually, it reduces the vacuum effect that can happen with the water flowing over the lower portion of the aircraft.
I have a picture of him flying over the Point Loma Lighthouse in that pontoon plane that he developed for the Navy.
Yes.
After that, there was a Bernoist in Florida. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
Well, it was quite, short-lived, as all the seaplane endeavors seem to be, but it served a purpose that none other could, and that was a short flight across Tampa Bay.
A shuttle service.
As I understand, it was a shuttle service. Is that correct?
Now, 17 miles from St. Petersburg to Tampa Bay, and took him 20 minutes to make the flight, as compared to...
Well, I think it was about 3 hours, wasn't it, by rail around the isthmus? So what an improvement.
So that actually probably was the first airline, or first scheduled airline.
Yes, I suspect and believe that it was.
What would come next after that?
Well, I believe that, was it the Junkers?
In World War I, the submarines were a serious problem, and the Allies developed something called a flying boat, and it had one purpose, one job.
Well, that was to patrol the North Atlantic and try to deal with the submarine problem.
There was even a silent movie called Submarine Patrol.
Yes.
And it had the flying boat in it.
That need then continued on into each of the world's countries, I think. A need for a seaplane to patrol.
And then moving on after the war, Junkers did come out with, what did they call that, a sea transport?
Sea transport. The sea transport, I think, was a result of the restrictions that, of course, were properly applied to Germany's development of aircraft after the war. And as I understand it, they were able then to get permission from I believe the League of Nations gave them permission to use and build a seaplane to carry mail.
And oddly enough, it turned out that they were sold mostly in Canada and Alaska.
Canada and Alaska, and I think also they were used in South America, Brazil, Argentina, where Germany had quite a large development in the seaplane routes.
Continuing on, tell our viewers about the Schneider races.
Well, the Schneider races and the Schneider prize, as it was called, was developed to, I guess you'd say, honor those who are developing seaplanes. There were many who entered into that quest for the prize, to be called the Schneider Trophy. Glenn Curtis, of course, our own Glenn Curtis, was a winner of that trophy in 1925, and that was at a speed of almost 400 miles per hour.
With those pontoons hanging down there. Yeah. Aerodynamically dirty with pontoons, and they still got those speeds.
Yes, interestingly, that I believe that trophy and that speed still holds for a seaplane.
What would be next then? Would it be the...
That's the development of BBY and some of those.
Well, the Martin...
yes.
The Martin China Clipper? Actually, it was the Martin flying boat?
Yes, it was. The development of the flying boat, of course, all the flying boats at that time were limited to perhaps a 500-mile distance, so they had to do that in hops between islands or between vessels anchored in the ocean. Juan Tripp and Lindbergh picked up a Martin 130 from the Glen Martin factory. It carried 41 passengers. It cruised 130 miles an hour, which is about the speed of our light planes these days.
Or a Ford tri-motor.
Yes, and had a distance of about 3,200-mile range. But because the seaplane could use the long runways of the water, that is many miles versus perhaps...
There was no end for the runway.
That's correct. They could then load enough fuel on and build them large enough to make those flights between the mainland and Hawaii, for example, and on down into South America, and eventually across the Atlantic Ocean.
Was it Dornier that built the VOX?
Yes, it was the VOX, and it was a 12-cylinder, actually. You viewed 6 nacelles with 2 engines in each, one pushing and one pulling.
So it had 12 engines.
12 engines.
6 in front and 6 in back.
Yes. And still I understand and read that it was underpowered somewhat, although I believe that it, if I'm not incorrect, it held the record at the time for carrying the largest number of people into the air, which was about 160. The Dornier DOX was the forerunner of some of the world's, or of one of the world's fastest fighter planes, which was the Dornier 335, which utilized eventually a push and a pull engine with a pilot sitting in between.
Now, the United States then developed what we call the PBY. Would you tell our viewers about that?
Well, certainly, and of course that's that carries the mystique and my love of seaplanes. As a matter of fact, there is a beautiful PBY in our own, very own Aerospace Museum here in San Diego, and everyone should go to the Aerospace Museum and not only view the PBY, but all of the other fine airplanes that are restored and kept there. The PBY was used in particularly the Pacific for recovery of downed pilots as well as for submarine patrol.
It was called the Catalina.
The Catalina, yes.
And the San Diego Aerospace Museum is the first place to visit when you come to San Diego.
Absolutely.
And when you go out into the rotunda there, you'll actually see a PBY Catalina on display.
Absolutely. It's beautiful.
Then we come to the world's largest airplane, biggest airplane ever built, the Spruce Goose. Would you tell our viewers about that?
Goose. Well, the Spruce Goose, you know, aside from saying it was extremely large, I guess would say that it's also much like my airplane. It was made out of aircraft-grade spruce, and I believe they used birch plywood instead of mahogany ply. So
it was actually the Birch Goose.
Sort of the Birch Goose.
I've read that it was so big that you could actually put a 747 inside of the Spruce Goose.
I think that's very possible, looking at the size of it.
And it made one flight.
Yes, one flight, and as I understand it, the flight engineer, or at least the flight mechanic, was out in the wing when this I guess you'd say, inadvertent flight took place.
That's why Howard Hughes only went up to 10 feet.
Perhaps that was so, yes.
Okay. We'll continue on right after we come back from this important message. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Captain Fred's Aviation Theater. We're visiting with Gale Hess and his Vollmer Amphibian. Gale, let's talk about the performance of this airplane. What kind of a takeoff roll would it have?
Well, the takeoff roll on the on hard surface is roughly 500 feet. It depends, of course, on the factors of wind and those kinds of things.
And you would rotate at what speed?
At about 60 miles per hour.
And the climb rate?
The climb is about 500 feet per second. And those who are watching and familiar with aircraft will know that that pretty much equates to an Aeronca 7AC.
And cruising speed?
Cruising speed's 85 miles per hour. And giving a range with about 25 gallons of fuel of about 2.5 hours with some reserve.
How much fuel does it drink an hour?
Well, it takes about 6 to 6.5 properly leaned, and so that gives me a 2.5 hour.
And the cruising speed was what, did you say?
85 miles per hour.
And the range would be?
Well, I usually call it 200 miles.
So that's what, 2.5 hours?
That's a couple of hundred miles is about 2.5 hours.
And what about maneuverability? What would it stall at?
Well, it'll stall at about 45 miles per hour.
That's pretty slow.
So it is quite slow. As I say, it's much like an Aeronca 7AC and other light planes that we know of.
Now, when you bring it into land, you're actually, when you land, you're stalling the airplane. So you stall the airplane right above the runway. Well, that's what a landing is. It's a controlled stall. What about landing on water?
Well, there are a couple different scenarios that you use on water, and it depends on the surface of the water. Most of the landings are made in what I would call a stalled kind of landing. That is at or near a stall. Generally speaking, you set up a descent rate on the final approach to the water of somewhere around 300 feet per second per minute.
Do you bring it in nose high?
Per minute. And you do bring it in nose high a little bit, yes. If the water is glassy, and all of us and our viewers will know that on a glassy surface, it's very difficult to judge your height.
Yes.
So in that case, you do set up a descent rate of a little bit less, perhaps 100 to 200 feet per second, and a little power, and you just simply fly it onto the water.
Okay, now, after you've landed in the water and you've caught your limit of fish, you're ready for takeoff. How do you take off from water? Differently than on hard surface?
Well, I think with this airplane and most airplanes, light aircraft on the water, there's a tendency for them to move about laterally on the water in the initial stages of the takeoff. So there is a need for quite a bit of rudder and control with rudder on that initial start of the takeoff.
Do you have a longer takeoff roll on water?
The takeoff is about 800 to 1,000 feet with this aircraft at gross weight.
And as soon as you clear the water, then it's everything else is the same.
Yes.
Tell us about building this plane. You got the plans, and how did you start? What did you build first?
Well, I bought the plans, I want to tell you, from Vollmer Jensen in about 1968. And as often said in the home building community, my wife vacuumed over them for about 20 years. And I was talking to Vollmer one day, kidding me of not building, and I started the building process, completed it in 1995 for first flight.
What part did you build first?
The first thing I started building was to lay up the keel of the fuselage, utilizing a long metal beam down the
So you were actually building a boat.
Well, you know, interestingly, our viewers will know, too, if they're model builders, that it's built just like a model airplane. There are bulkheads built with gussets on each corner, laid out on flat surface, and then assemble on this through spar, if you will, or on through beam, and then there are stringers applied.
The only difference is you don't use straight pins to hold the balsa wood to the paper.
Well, that's exactly right. No, interestingly though, when putting the skin on, which are various thicknesses of mahogany plywood, you do use what are called nailing strips, and you put brads through them to hold the surface, so the glue or epoxy dries properly. Then you chip away the strip and pull out the nails.
Now, you built this in your garage in your home.
Yes, I did.
And then did you bring it to the airport to finish it, or I've seen pictures of it on a trailer.
Well, I finished all of the building process, if you will, and left it unassembled with the wings removed, tail empennage, and so forth. Trucked it to our Experimental Aircraft Association Chapter 14 at Brown Field. Assembled it down there in about 2 weeks, and with the help of a lot of the fine members down there, prepared for the first flight.
And who flew the first flight?
Well, I flew the first flight, yes. You notice
don't you usually hire a test pilot to fly that first flight?
Well, I think that most home builders probably do their own first flights. Perhaps with a higher performance aircraft, it is certainly wise to have a real expert, a person who's had many hours in the aircraft fly it.
Very good. We'll continue right after this important message. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Captain Fred's Aviation Theater. Today we're visiting with Gail Hess. Gail, tell our viewers when and how you learned to fly.
Well, it was one of, I guess, a desire developed as a young boy when I first saw an old, I think, Jenny land on the field next to our farmhouse. I was about age 5, and I continued to have that desire, building model airplanes, and at age 16, after our family had moved and lived near a small airport, I was able to start flying lessons by working in a meat market on the weekend and get enough money to perhaps get a half hour, 15 minutes of flight time.
How fortunate.
I was very fortunate young man at that time. That was,
now you soloed very quickly, I believe.
I soloed in 5 hours and 25 minutes. But of course, in those days, you didn't have quite as much radio.
What did you fly in?
I learned to fly soloed in a T-Craft BC-12D.
A Taylor craft.
Taylor craft, yes. In a Taylor craft. And
Mr. Taylor was a partner with Piper.
Yes.
And what they call a Piper Cub was really a Taylor Cub.
Yes, yes. Well, this was a small farm field, rolling hills in the grass. Nice place to learn to fly. The meadowlarks in the evening and the nice evenings to fly.
And from the Taylor craft, what did you go to?
Well, fortunately again, I had some help, $400 worth of help to buy what was called a Myers OTW. And the Myers OTW was...
it was a biplane.
Well, it was a biplane, yes. And it was much, Mr. Myers built the Myers OTW. That stood for Out to Win, hoping to get the Navy contract for primary trainers. But I was able to, fortunately, buy this aircraft and get some time. In about 35 hours, I got my private license at age 17 in 1947.
You were just about ripe for the Korean War, weren't you?
Well, I was just about ready for that. There were other things I was doing, like finishing high school and so forth.
Now, you played in a band, too.
I was playing in a couple orchestras, and one large orchestra similar in sound to Ray Anthony and the like.
Now, you served in the Marines during the Korean War?
I decided to go into the Marines very shortly after high school, and to see the world, as they say, And I guess that proves how wrong you can be sometimes, because I did get to see the combat in Korea.
And after you got out of the Marines, you went into parachute jumping.
Well, I think that was one of maybe monetary consideration because it was less cost than flying, but I did become the president of the Los Angeles Skydivers. We did a series for the You Ask For It television show, and these were professionals from mostly from Lockheed and the like, and many folks were some of the more famous people in aviation were our honorary members.
Art Baker was the host, wasn't he?
Art Baker, I believe it
You
was.
Ask For
Yes,
It?
for You Ask For It. Tony LeVere flew the aircraft. Those
That's
days,
a famous name.
we didn't have a way to mount cameras on the helmets at that time. So Tony flew an airplane with a photographer in the back and in a split S dive to get the photos of our free falls.
I believe you were president of the EAA, too.
Well, yes, I was. I was very fortunate to be president of a fine bunch of folks. We're the largest chapter in the world, and we say the friendliest.
That's Chapter 14, San Diego.
14 of San Diego, and about 400 to 500 members. There are many aircraft having been built, and many in the process, and we'd welcome all the folks to come down and see us.
Now, they serve lunch open to the public
Yes, we
every
do.
Saturday at 11 o'clock.
Every Saturday.
And they're right next to the base of the control tower at Brown Field.
That's correct.
And that's the EAA Chapter 14.
EAA Chapter 14's facilities are large and many aircraft to look at.
And they'll be able, if they come, they don't have to come for lunch, but if they come down there, they'll be able to meet pilots and see the actual home-built airplanes, probably you.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you very much for visiting with us today.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you.
This is Captain Fred saying, I love airplanes and I honor the people who fly them.